My name's Karen Throsby and I've been researching and writing about marathon swimming for the last 7 years. Marathon swimming is the sport of swimming a long way through open water under a particular set of conditions and rules. So these rules are very tradition oriented and nod back nostalgically, if a little arbitrarily, to the first English Channel swim. So the first English Channel swim was in 1875 by Captain Matthew Webb, and the first woman swam the Channel in 1926. That was Gertrude Ederle, who was a US Olympian swimmer. In those cases, they wore wool or silk costumes and various kinds of goggles and so on, depending on the time. Modern marathon swimming takes that as the principle and says that you can only swim with a regular textile costume, cap and goggles, and you can't touch anything for support or propulsion. So you would have a boat with you normally, but you can't hold on to the boat to have a rest or to have it carry you forwards. And you can't use anything that would provide any kind of insulation, so you couldn't use a wetsuit or anything like that that would come between you and the water. So they're the basic principles. You swim from shore to shore unaided without holding on to anything. You would have a boat with you for safety, for navigation, and you'd have a crew on the boat that would be there to look after you, to provide you with food, lower drinks down to you on a rope or pass it to you by hand, and to make sure that you're safe. So perhaps the iconic marathon swim, as an example, is the English Channel. The English Channel is 21 miles across at its narrowest point. It ranges from about 15 to 18 degrees C during the summer swimming season, which is, say, July to September. And approximately 50 to 100 people swim across the Channel solo each year. So this is what I started studying. I started studying specifically English Channel swimming, and this took the form of a project called Becoming a Channel Swimmer, which was from 2009 to 2012. And this was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. The project started from my own swimming. I was training in 2008. I started training for a 2010 English Channel swim. And in the course of that first season of training, I started to think critically, sociologically, about what I was doing to my own body, what that might mean socially in different contexts. And so I applied for some funding and got some money to study this process in much more detail. And the methodology of the project took two different forms. Firstly, it was an autoethnography. So that was using my own body as the means of studying the process of becoming a Channel swimmer. And so I kept very detailed field notes of my own training over 2 seasons of training leading up to my English Channel swim, where I would document what it felt like, how my body changed, how I'd had to treat my body differently, and also what that body means socially in terms of its shape, its size, the markings on it, and the knowledge of what I was training for. So there's that side of it. And then the other part of the project was a more conventional multi-sited ethnography, where I travelled around the UK. I studied local training sites in the West Midlands, where I was living at the time, on the south coast, mostly in Dover, where there's a very large seasonal training community, mostly of English Channel swimmers. I went to training camps in Cork in Ireland and in Gozo, the island of Gozo in Malta, to train there and to study what was going on in those training camps. I worked on one of the training camps for a while also. And then I spent a month in California visiting 2 very large and very mixed training communities, one in San Francisco, where there's a swimming bay called Aquatic Park, where there's a significant amount of open water swimming, including marathon swimming, and La Jolla Cove in San Diego, where again there's a big and kind of year-round swimming community, ranging from kind of daily dippers to people who are training for long marathon swims. And I spent a lot of time just hanging out in those places, talking to swimmers, going swimming a lot, and meeting coaches, boat pilots, crew members, family members, and even just chatting with passers-by who were watching the swimming and getting their impressions. So the analysis for the project really then focused on 3 levels. The first level was at the level of the individual body. And that was mostly focusing on my own body. And that was really to ask this question about what do you have to do to a body to enable it to swim extraordinary distances? And then what does that mean socially? What are the social effects of those kind of cultivated capacities? So that was the first set of framing for the project. The second frame was the social world of marathon swimming, the community within which that becoming a channel swimmer or a marathon swimmer happens. And I'm particularly interested in the community in terms of how it creates a particular identity. So how is social belonging produced and policed? What counts as legitimate marathon swimming? What doesn't count? And how are those boundaries of authentic swimming versus inauthentic swimming policed and maintained? So for example, would doing a marathon swim, say that like the English Channel in a wetsuit, be counted in the same way as a swim without a wetsuit? And the marathon swimming community would say very strongly that it wouldn't, that that's not authentic swimming. And so I was very interested in how those debates played out, who the authoritative voices are, and what kind of discursive strategies are working to make those boundaries even sort of provisionally secure, to guard, I think, against the perceived threat of inauthentic kinds of swimming. So that's the second frame. The third frame is the much broader context of what we might think of as the neoliberal present. And in particular, I was interested in those aspects of contemporary life around individualization, engaging with risk and risk management, entrepreneurship of the self, making the self, and the importance in social relations of competition. And I was interested in placing marathon swimming in that context and thinking about, if we use marathon swimming as a lens, what can it tell us about this broader society? What can it tell us about what counts as the good body, as the bodies that we like in contemporary society? What can it tell us about health and the category of health? And what can it tell us about sport and the status of sport? I think marathon swimming is a very minority practice. It's done by a very small number of people. Most people won't have come across marathon swimmers or may just have seen pictures of English Channel swimmers, but wouldn't know that much about it. And I think there was a little bit of suspicion at first about what could marathon swimming tell us about these sort of broader sociological questions. But I think the research has shown that it's a very useful lens, because even though marathon swimming is quite distinct in many ways, it's always part of the social, and the ways we have to make sense of marathon swimming come from that wider social context. And so that's been the work of the project, has been to place marathon swimming in that wider context by looking in those three frames. The research has now been written up in a book. The book's called Immersion, Marathon Swimming, Embodiment and Identity, and it's published by Manchester University Press in August 2016. And it's really a study of two different kinds of immersion: the immersion of being literally a body in water, and the idea of being immersed in an activity, of being passionately involved in an activity, of identifying very strongly with an activity and then trying to make sense of that to the self and others. And that's the concern of the book. And so what the book's key argument really is that the resources that we have available to us, the discursive resources that we have available to us to account for a sport like marathon swimming, really only offer a very narrow view of the sport and what it involves and what values it lives by, it involves, and so on. And so by looking more closely at the everyday practice of the sport, of the way its meanings are created online and in personal interaction, what we can see is a much more nuanced, complicated series of engagements with the body, with the water, with ideas of good citizenship and sport and health than we might get from the immediate sort of outward facing representations of the sport. And that's really the concern of the book.